Hey, Steve and Paul and Christy and Jeremy and Catherine, you guys too. But before we start, tomorrow my niece is starting the measurement program at UNCG.
That's cool.
Yeah, I'm so proud. I'm so proud.
I have the kid down.
What's that?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I said a new dynasty.
Yeah, what's that, Steve?
There's a kid down the street at the coffee shop who's a physics and math major who's interested in psychometrics now. I drew an ICC for him on a coffee napkin to get him interested in psychometrics. He's asking me about it now.
Oh, that's brilliant. I love that.
So your niece probably had no chance against you, Kristen, right?
None. Not when she told me at last year's family reunion that she was looking for a career change.
Wow.
And she was interested in doing something really different, but that could also, she's been a vet for 20 years. So she'll bring a really interesting perspective.
All yours, Paul.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Do you see a screen that says what is the value proposition for principled assessment design?
Yes, I would go into presenter mode with it.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our NCME session, our virtual NCME session this morning. What is the value proposition for principled assessment design? I'm Paul Nichols from NWEA. And today in our session, we will have Kristen Huff from Curriculum Associates, Steve Ferrara from Cognia, Catherine Needham from NWEA, and her co-author Christy Schneider. And our discussant will be Jeremy Henniger from Nebraska Department of Education. I'm going to open the session today by just framing it a little bit about what is a business model for principled assessment design. And the question that I started with was, why not more PADD? Why not more principled assessment design? Now, principled assessment design has been around for at least 17 years, and you have sort of predecessors for it earlier than that. And so you might think PADD would be everywhere, but it's not, even though it appears to offer many benefits. Principled assessment design seems to offer a stronger validity argument, a more coherent assessment system, more efficient assessment design and development. But PADD is not used everywhere. So why not? Well, let's start at first by setting the stage by talking about what is PADD. What is principled assessment design? And it's different things to different people, but I think the core value proposition for principled assessment design is that it allows a customer, and that customer in the education Department of Education, like a state assessment director, or it may be a person in a testing company. It allows that customer to consistently create, or maybe a teacher, to create assessment content and scoring rules that invoke evidence of targeted constructs at targeted levels of cognitive complexity. That's what I think the value proposition is. And there are some foundational elements that Steve and co-authors identified in a chapter a couple of years ago. One is that principled assessment design across all the different approaches has some clear, explicit definition of the assessment target in terms of knowledge and skills, and often captured then as PLDs. It involves the purposeful, and purposeful is really important, manipulation of assessment item and activity features to achieve the level of complexity and difficulty or the proficiency level, descriptor level that you're targeting. It also has an emphasis on reusable tools like item and task templates, design patterns that you get through unpacking of the knowledge and skills. So that's what I think of principled assessment design. Not everyone, not even everyone in this session may see it that way. So what's the value then of PAD? Well, let's define value. PAD value would be benefits minus cost, where benefits are perceived in terms of the problems that principled assessment design would solve or the needs that it meets, and costs are both tangible and intangible. Costs like how much time does it take to create a science task? And intangible is, is it threatening, something new? Is the language involved in principled assessment design accessible? And of course, it's not just straightforward value, it's always relative. And that's relative to the competitor value. How much value does principled assessment design offer versus its competitor, which would probably be conventional assessment design. And of course, the customers, the buyers and users determine that value through adoption. So why adopt PAD? First of all, invention does not ensure adoption. Right? Just because PAD is invented 70 years ago or more doesn't mean it's going to be adopted. Just because it's a cool idea doesn't mean it's going to be adopted. There's a lot involved. And here's a model that I've adapted from PAD adoption, adapted from this website, Jobs to be Done, which is a wonderful website. And it talks about the motivators and blockers for adopting principled assessment design that work within the environment that you are, that your customer or your buyer or user works within. There's always the push, and the push might be that, let's say you're a vice president in a testing company, your customer themselves may be asking for it. Or the standards are requiring elements of principled assessment design to be used. So that's pushing you. The pull is the benefit you're seeing from it, and that might be that you see a benefit of possibly less expensive development of, let's say, science tasks. But there's also a lot of inertia. So there's blockers. And that part of that is inertia. Like, you have to learn a lot of new concepts and a lot of new terminology. And then there's also anxiety. What if this doesn't work? I'm investing some of my department funds in this. If it doesn't work, then we're behind our schedule, and we have also lost quite a bit of our budget, perhaps, and maybe I lose status in terms of the internal to the company. So that's the testing company I was talking about, the environment, the blockers, the motivator, and then there's the job to be done. What might PAD help that testing company vice president do? And the job to be done is something enduring. And for the testing company vice president, who's, let's say, building content, in charge of building content, that job hasn't changed for decades, really. It's helping that VP find manageable ways to lead others in creating a pool of assessment content that satisfies contract or product requirements. That job is there, whether it's paper and pencil, online, you have CAT, linear, it's still the same. It's the same job, essentially. One thing I'm going to argue is that maybe we're coming to an inflection point for principled assessment design. Inflection points are indicated by learning indicators, and an inflection point is something that where your basic assumptions around the business change dramatically. You saw that, Netflix is the classic example, and Blockbuster. Suddenly, Blockbuster found that its basic assumptions for its business model were changed And they were changed by the environment around it changing, like technology offering streaming, but they were also changed because Netflix themselves came in and sparked change in the environment. And you can see these things, this change in terms of leading indicators. And there are a lot of leading indicators now that would suggest that the relative value of principled assessment design may be on the rise. For example, construct frameworks are becoming more complex, less applicable. So it raises the value of principled assessment design versus conventional assessment development. You have state and district science specialists are not altogether happy, in my experience, with a conventional test design approach. And when the customer is not happy, they're open to a competitor or an alternative. Conventional content development has increasing pain points like standard setting for state customers. Big, expensive, you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So that's a pain point. Also, you can do things now that only a large testing organization located in one place, let's say Iowa City, and on a campus, could have done in the past. And at the same time, digitalization, like PDFs, online sites, they've made accessible all the learning sciences research that has the foundation for these more complex construct frameworks. So now, anyone sitting at their desk like I am can access all of that research and better understand what it means, for example, modeling in science. So, whoops. So that's our start. That's the way I wanted to set up and frame this. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kristen Huff to make our next presentation on our only job is helping teachers teach and students learn. Why PADDI is essential.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. I'm happy to be here, folks. I was telling everyone prior to, oh, Paul, am I presenting or are you presenting for me?
I am presenting.
Okay.
The slides up on your screen.
I still see your slides.
Hmm. I want to stop sharing for a moment and see. How do you see them?
Oh, yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here presenting at NCME Virtual Conference. I was telling my co-presenters right before we opened it up to everyone. I got kind of nostalgic this morning in prepping for this presentation about how much I miss being at NCME and seeing everyone. And I'm just really happy that Steve and Yaya and Drew and Thanos and Ada created this space for us to get together, and Ethan from NCME too. So thank you. So Paul, I am going to go ahead and start my timer because you know this is something I could talk about forever. And so I've got my timer started, and I'd like to go ahead and say that a lot of what I'm sharing here is it comes from a chapter that I've been working on with my fearless co-authors, Paul and Christy, on test design that will be in the next edition of Ed Measurement. And so there's a plug for that chapter. There's a lot. This is like the tip of the iceberg of what we've been talking about. So Shazam, Paul. We've decided to say Shazam when we want the slides to advance. So go ahead. So, oh, go back. There, wait, go ahead. There, just one page at a time, Paul. You got excited, sorry about that. So I have two premises for why we have to have principled assessment design. I think, as I put in the chat while Paul was talking, the inflection point is now, in fact, I think the inflection point was like 15 years ago and we were really far behind. So every year that I continue to advocate for ECD or PAD, my argument is going to get stronger and more strident and with a stronger sense of urgency. in a nutshell, I think in educational assessment, specifically for this conversation, I'm talking about K-12 assessments that are designed primarily to inform instructional choices. But even broader than that, assessments designed with conventional approaches just are not adequate for today's context. Constructs that are being assessed are more complex. Look at CC, look at the Common Core, look at NGSS. Assessment results are being used for a variety of purposes, and I am actually a strong supporter of that when there's validity evidence to do so. But as those uses become more nuanced, our validity evidence has to become more rich and more varied, and that requires a more sophisticated approach to design. Assessment quality is under more public scrutiny than ever, and yes, I can attest to that personally. And our understanding of accessibility in the broadest sense, and I will get to this towards the end of my talk, our understanding of accessibility is rapidly evolving, and it's becoming simultaneously broader and more nuanced. And with all of that, Paul, next slide, we also are under tremendous pressure in today's educational system, even before March of 2020. All of this becomes even more complicated when the primary purpose of the assessment is to help educators make instructional decisions. It's just critical that we do better. When the primary inferences are about what students know and can do, and not just where they rank in some order against their peers, we have to get better at design. So Paul, on to my second premise. I'll be brief here because this is one of my other favorite topics that should be another session altogether. When you adopt a principled approach to assessment design, you take a more coherent approach to the work from what is traditionally or conventionally fragmented. For example, if you just think about the way you build traditional assessments, it's like an assembly line. First, we're going to have the content specs. We're going to throw it over to the item writers, and then it's kind of like a relay with handoffs, and you end up having a set of content specifications and a set of psychometric specifications that aren't even integrated, which undermines your entire validity argument. So it's really important. Next slide, Paul. It's really important, again, nope, go back up. Sorry, this is fun. Again, this coherence is essential when the primary purpose is to inform instructional choices, because you have to think about the model of cognition that is undergirding all of the assumptions that drive your assessment design. And you have to think about how the results of the assessment cohere with the curriculum and the model of curriculum and instruction, which is rooted in some sort of perspective on how students learn, pedagogy, how to teach, and how students learn from that teaching, as well as very pragmatic scope and sequence. All of that has to be considered in order for you to do the job that you've been assigned, which is to create a test that is to effectively inform instruction. Okay, now moving on. So one of the things that I like to do when I talk about PADD is to try to demystify it and try to say, yes, there has been, a lot out there about evidence-centered design, principled assessment, design for inquiry, on, and it gets very jargony and very process heavy. But you know what? It's just not that complicated. So I'm going to break it down to its essential features, its essential characteristics, and use that as a lever to try to convince you that the value proposition of what we're recommending is actually just basic good practice. So the distinguishing characteristics of principled assessment design, very simple. The construct is informed by learning science. What do we know about how students learn and build deep conceptual knowledge and prepare themselves to learn more? Explicit articulation of all assumptions and all design decisions, and those articulations actually become design tools, and those design tools are what help us create the coherence from that, moving from a learning science theory all the way through the score reporting and interpretations. Without it, all of our good intentions will be lost without good documentation and using this documentation as design tools. And then, of course, in principled assessment design, we talk a lot about the role of evidence. And this is in contrast to conventional approaches to assessment design, where the focus is primarily on psychometric properties. I'm not suggesting this is an either or, it's a both and, but it really is a shift in mindset and a shift in priority. So Paul, go ahead to move on. The essential elements of PADD are basically three processes. You analyze the domain, you model the domain, and you create design patterns. This is the design process. This is not the execution of the assessment. Okay, the execution of the assessment would require administration, which has its whole other framework, and then collection of data, etc. This is just about the design. Within the domain, you define the construct, you prioritize your assessment targets. This all comes from your theory of learning and cognition that is undergirding your theory of action for the assessment and how it will inform or play a role in the instructional endeavor. In the modeling of the domain, you define your approach to cognition and how that will play out in the PLDs, performance level descriptions. You develop those, and from the PLDs, you create your task features. And I posit, or we posit in our chapter, that as part of defining your task features, identifying the difficulty drivers is a key aspect. I would like to posit that as long as you have some of each of these elements in your system, you are doing principled assessment design. And so it's a very pared down approach. It's really about your mindset and your research and your documentation more than anything else. I'm going to focus in the next few minutes on the critical role of performance level descriptions when you are designing an assessment to inform instruction. So Paul, go ahead, move on. So great, thank you. So one of the things I've learned in the last few years at Curriculum Associates, which is the first place I've worked where it's not where testing is not front and center. We are a curriculum and instruction and service company, and we have an assessment in service of all of that. And so in creating PLDs, one of the biggest lessons learned for me is that everything I've learned about PLDs to date has been with very much a focus on how do we build PLDs from within the perspective of the assessment, and we have hope that it will somehow inform instruction and curriculum. Well, here we had to build PLDs in partnership with our instruction team, and it was a great learning experience, and I would very strongly recommend that you figure out how to do that no matter what test you're developing if it requires PLDs. Because the PLDs, to support both curriculum and instruction and assessment, need to be written from an unrestricted point of view with regard to the assessment constraints. And of course, when you're working with people who are experts in pedagogy and instruction, it has to be informed by everything that is key and important to their work and not just assessments. From there, we then modify the PLDs a bit to do some things that we needed to do on the assessment side of the house that did have to take the assessment constraints into perspective, such as standard setting, creating item specifications, informing reports about our inferences about what students know and can do and what they need to do on the next step to take them along the progression. And then making sure that all of this is always in the context of driving towards proficiency for the student. I have 3 minutes left, so I'm gonna go really fast so I can make my main point. But Paul, move ahead to slide 9. This is just an example of PLDs. I like to give my colleague and partner on the chapter, Christy, credit for this PLD. I don't have time to go into it, but here it's about making sure that PLDs have all of the right components to facilitate the building of task models and task features later in the design process. Next slide. Another thing that is really critical in this endeavor is making sure that we are super, super explicit about the role of verbs. And one thing I'll say to this that I would like people to understand is that if we don't get super explicit about the verbs, and that will be used in the item prompts to the student and in the score reports to the students and their parents and the educators, and then we risk a lack of coherence. And the biggest risk in my mind to that lack of coherence is a misinterpretation of rigor. We do not want to think that students are doing sophisticated things like analyzing and evaluating, and then we actually only ask them to do identification. That is a disservice to the learning endeavor. And when we leave all of these verbs up to the imagination of the item writer, we risk that type of lack of coherence. I'm going to go ahead and skip down. Paul, skip to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. Okay, so what is the value proposition for principled assessment design? I hope in this short time I have convinced you that if you're truly trying to have coherence with instruction and curriculum, you have no choice but to get really detailed. Frankly, if my boss came to me and said, I need you to build a test so we can rank order students and give them some percentiles, I may say, PAD, not sure if that's really needed. But that's not the world we live in for any assessment, I would argue. We still have a lot to figure out when it comes to technology enhanced items, and without this level of precision in our discussion and design of those, we're probably making some pretty egregious errors in terms of what we think cognitive processes students are using versus ones that they really are. Accessibility, especially for computers, is getting more and more complex, as is our notions of wanting to make sure that all students are engaged. And so now, as we as a field grapple with how do we make sure that our assessments reflect culturally and linguistic responsiveness, which is a goal that we should all have, especially if there is coherence with instruction. We need to make sure we as a field are decentering whiteness in our item banks, as well as including anti-racist content. And frankly, last slide, if you're not doing PAD, I'm asking you, without it, what exactly are you doing? Because I'm not sure. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Our next presenter will be Steve Ferrara. And can you see Steve's slides? Steve, can you see these?
I can, Paul. Can you put it in presenter mode?
Well, okay. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Paul. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be able to speak with you, even though I can't see you. It's kind of weird. I miss having, like Kristen said, I miss having seen everybody. But it is kind of cool to do an NCME presentation with a t-shirt on and athletic clothes. I'm kind of enjoying that. What I'm going to talk about is how we're using a principled approach at Cognia. I want to make an important point here, which is that I don't intend this as a commercial for how Cognia uses a principled approach to design, development, and implementation. That's not the case here. What I'm talking about is the way that I've developed our PADDI approach that's being implemented in Cognia. We call it PADDI. It's not a very creative title. It's an acronym for Principled Assessment, Design, Development, and Implementation. It's based on work that I first did with Paul Nichols and Emily Lai and my friends and colleagues at Pearson. And I'm going to tell you about it as we move forward. So if you could advance the slide, please, Paul. I'm going to talk a little bit about definitions, about principled approaches in general and their common elements. Then I'm going to talk about the version that we're using right now, that again, we call PADDI. I'm going to talk about 3 value propositions for PADDI. And one of the advantages of talking about the PADDI approach at Cognia is that when I talk about these value propositions, I can do it in very specific terms about the value propositions for Cognia as a company providing products and services for assessment clients, and also talk about value propositions for our very specific real clients. So I'll also make a smaller point, which is these are not in what I'm going to talk about today is our practices at Cognia, but what I say is not endorsed by Cognia. This is me talking. So if you'd advance the slide, please, Paul. So here are the definitions that I'd like to talk about. For me, value propositions can be thought of as claims that something is important or useful to someone. And value propositions, Paul, if you would, I guess I have to say Shazam to get your attention. Value proposition for principled approaches to state summative assessment. And I'm distinguishing state summative assessment from the context that Kristen was talking about, are important and useful to 2 groups, vendors like Cognia and WEA and so forth, and our clients who use the information from the state assessments for a variety of purposes. And finally, Paul, I'm gonna define value in the way that Paul did earlier, which value in this context can be construed as benefits minus costs, where costs could be actual financial costs, financial risks, and opportunity costs, like opportunity costs. So if you'd move on, please, Paul. So in the chapter that Paul cited briefly, we talked about, Paul was one of the co-authors, we talked about 5 approaches to principled approaches. The obvious, most famous one is ECD, evidence-centered design, but there's also Susan Embertson's work, Rick Lick's work, Mark Wilson's work, and then the stuff that Paul and Emily Lai and I worked on together that we called, this was at Pearson, that we called principled design for efficacy. If you could advance one, there we go. There are 6 elements that are common to all of these principled approaches, and we outline those in the chapter that's being cited here. But to put it briefly, it always starts with you have to define the content. Kristen talked about doing domain analysis and domain definition. So defining the content and then talking about what claims you want to make about people. We've translated that into a couple of things, which includes score, interpretation, and use statements, SIU statements. And those are terms that come straight out of the standards for educational and psychological testing. When you read the introduction, there's a phrase there, score interpretations for uses. So SIU statements, and then task models and so forth are all common elements to these 5 principled approaches. So Paul, would you advance, please? This is a visual description of Cognia's PADDI approach. There's several things to say. The first is that the light blue boxes are a portrayal of traditional practice. Traditional practice meaning the way we've been doing things for years, even though we may have principal elements embedded, the way Kristen talked about. So the traditional practices, you write a test blueprint based on how much testing time you have and what kind of items you want to use, and then you go through the process, deliver the test, and you score and report. Well, if you look at ECD, using it as an example, there's kind of there's an inference you could draw that in order to become an ECD shop, so to speak, you have to tear down your principles, your infrastructure, your practices, and start all over again. Now, nobody's going to do that. No one can afford to do it. Nobody wants to do it. So we took the approach of, let's take our current practices and build those common elements from all of the principled approaches. Let's build it into our infrastructure, into our practices, into our ways of thinking, and evolve from our current practices into this principled approach. And that's the idea of PADDI. So what we did was we took the light blue boxes, a portrayal of our traditional practices, and we took these common elements, the 7 common elements over in the PADDI key on the right, and those are consistent with the common elements on the previous slide, and we built them in to each of the places where where traditional practice is already operating, where there's infrastructure, processes, understandings, and so forth. And so that's our PADDI approach. Paul, if you could move on. I propose 3 value propositions specifically for PADDI. It provides opportunities to improve our design, development, and score reporting design processes and outcomes. Second, as an innovation to practice, it points out other opportunities for innovation that we can implement with fidelity, meaning without doing workarounds just to fill out a form, but actually build it into our practices. And the third is that PADDI offers an opportunity to enhance identification of validity evidence and supports our development of what we call validity argument technical reports. So let me examine at least a couple of these, depending on how long it takes me to get through them in the time I have left. So Paul, if you would. So the first value proposition, it guides improvement efforts. On the Cognia side, it's actually, I'm seeing a shift in staff thinking. People are now saying, okay, we have to make a decision here. What are the principles? What is the practice? What are the practices? What are the evidence that we have so that we can make a design decision or a development decision and so forth. And a second place where I've seen evidence of improvement efforts is the score report design team, which this team has become very principled, including they talk about specific information elements, not just score reports, but the information elements in each side, in each part of the static reports and the dynamic reports. And they do it in this principled fashion specifically to support the SIU statements that we develop for each one of our programs. Our clients, and I'm talking about one specific client in this case, sees this value. The evidence they've shown us is that they asked us to brief us on all the steps in the PADDI process so that they not only understand what they're doing with us right now, most recently it was developing the SIU statements, and also so they could see down the road what they're going to be doing next as part of the PADDI process. And finally, I think the evidence seems pretty strong. They see the value in the SIU statements. They asked us to do focus groups with educators and parents, which went quite well actually, despite the sort of abstract nature of talking about SIU statements. Paul, the next slide, please.
Just a minute. Here, sorry.
All right, I'm going to have to go quickly here, but I only have 2 more slides after this. So value proposition 2, PADDI points out other innovation opportunities. One of the areas is in something that I've been calling item ALD alignment. The paper I wrote 3 years ago I called it full alignment, but the notion is if you have items arrayed as in an ordered item book or an item map, you want to make sure that their location on the scale and the response demands of the items in a particular level, like proficient, that those item response demands correspond to the descriptions of knowledge and skills in the corresponding proficient PLD. We're actually now doing an exploratory study for one of our assessment programs right now where we're looking at item ALD alignment. In the paper I show that you don't always have alignment. Sometimes items located in a particular range of a scale align a little bit better with a different proficiency level descriptor. I could talk about that at great length, and I won't do that here. But the point is, PADDI points out other innovation opportunities for us, and our clients see it in terms of the SIU statements and item ALD alignment, so that they can build that into their peer review submissions for at least these 3 critical elements that I have listed here. Paul, the next slide, very briefly. Another way that a third value proposition is that it helps us write validity argument technical reports, which is what we do now. We no longer do data dump technical reports. We actually write interpretive arguments and validity arguments. And in the last chapter of the report, we put a scorecard indicating all of the claims, which we typically write in the form of SIU statements, all of the evidence that's relevant to those claims, and then we evaluate the relevance and strength of that of the evidence in relationship to the claims, and the scorecard indicates whether the evidence is complete and persuasive, moderate, or weak and missing, which now gives us the basis for not only for the validity argument technical report, but the scorecard gives us the basis for setting priorities for a research agenda. I'll end with this last point, Paul, if you would. There are 2 key considerations from my point of view. The first is all of the potential benefits of implementing a principled approach have not yet been identified. If you could click it once, Paul. Related to that, we've not yet identified all of the blockers to implementing a principled approach for operational state assessment programs. And if you click twice more, Paul, I'll finish up with these 2 related statements. Second, another consideration, we do not yet have results from efficacy and effectiveness studies to determine the benefits and drawbacks of principled approaches. We just don't know in what ways it's going to add quality to the information we produce from assessment programs so that we can calculate value. So with that, I'll say thanks, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Steve. Our next presenter is Catherine Needham from NWEA. And Catherine, let me get this set up.
Thank you, Paul.
And I will start it. I'm getting better hope as we go along.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? See a chat that says yes? Be great. Great. Thank you. As Paul said, my name's Catherine, and I have a confession to make. I am neither a psychometrician, a content specialist, or a learning scientist. I'm a product manager. So I represent the business side of taking products to market. And so I'll probably bring a slightly different perspective, but I figure that's why I was invited. So with that, let's go to the first slide. So if you read our paper, you know that we conducted some primary research around whether PAD had value to the market in the NGSS domain of assessment. And how we came to doing this research was really a group of researchers, such as people like Paul and Christy Schneider, suggested that PAD is the best way to develop an NGS assessment that would provide instructionally relevant feedback for teachers. And I said, well, that's great, but does the market care? In other words, do I have buyers and users who are willing to pay for such an assessment? And so we agreed to use the Pragmatic Institute framework, which is sort of the methodology product managers use to develop and bring products to market, to assess whether the market placed value on PAD. And so if you go to the next slide, please, Paul. You know, why, and then the big question is why NGSS, right? I mean, there are other domains we could have talked about using PAD with, but we felt that NGSS is a really important domain to get right. You can see here that there's research that there's a gap between the assessments currently in the market and their ability to provide really good evidence for teachers to use in the classroom. We know they're complex. The standards are very complex. And so developing assessments is hard. It's hard for professionals, and it's certainly hard for teachers. And it's expensive. You know, Paul talked about cost, and we've looked at the many steps that can potentially go into the process. And so you want to make sure that if you're going to use your precious resources and spend that time, that you're going to come up with a solution that will be embraced by the market, right? So that is an important reason for us to use PIF, if you will, the Pragmatic Institute framework, to start to investigate the value that the market placed on PAD in relation to NGSS. If we go to the next slide, please. And just straight up, our hypothesis was that PAD is the only way to create NGSS assessments that have score interpretations that are useful for instruction for teachers. So it was a bold hypothesis. And if we go to the next slide, please, Paul. I'll talk a little bit about how the Pragmatic Institute framework works and how we used it to help us test our hypothesis. So basically PIF, it provides standard language and a set of tools and protocols for product managers, and in this case, learning scientists, to test the market, to see whether a problem is worth solving and whether it has value to the market. And then it takes you through a series of protocols and steps if you find that you have a good idea that is worth solving, to building out that product and taking it to market. And once it's in the market, maintaining it. You know, you're never done, right? So if you look at the image on the right, you can see that there are a series of blue boxes, in each of those boxes going from the most strategic to the left to the more tactical to the right, is how product managers come up with ideas and then take them through to actual products in the market. And the first step is always primary market research. There's a credo in pragmatic marketing that says, while your opinion, meaning us in the building where we work, is interesting, it is not relevant unless the market agrees with you. So off we go to the market. If you can go to the next slide, please, Paul. We partnered with a national marketing research firm and developed a representative sample of NGSS states as well as the Nebraska market, which roughly counts for 37% of students in the science market. However, there are other superintendents who have said that they think that science is, as tested in the NGSS, is important. And so really, while this is 37% of the market, there's about 70% of the market is really interested in NGSS, but we feel that 37% is adequate. We built 2 surveys. One that was for teachers, and which we all think of as users, people who operate the assessment, and the other for buyers. And we conducted them in January and February of this year. And if we go to the next slide, please. And also, as we developed our instruments, one thing that we wanted to also test was not just, does the market recognize value in PAD and acknowledge it, but also what particular PAD solutions are important to buyers and users. So it wasn't enough just to say, is PAD important to you? Would you pay for PAD? It was, in particular, what solutions within the PAD framework would be most valuable to you. So we included testlet versions within the survey so that people could experience what we were talking about. As Krista made the point that it can be very abstract. And so we wanted to make it very real for the people who were taking the surveys. So you can see that we tested 4 different concepts, and I won't read these all to you, but you get the idea. Let's move on. Thank you. And in terms of our sample size, we had buyers and users, and buyers were curriculum directors and deputy superintendents. And we had teachers who were science teachers for middle school and high school, and we had 146 buyers and 196 teachers in total. And you can see that our demographics were based on district size. So this was really testing in the district market as opposed to the state market. Thank you, Paul. So I want to talk a minute from a product perspective about buyers and users. So why do we care? What is the difference? The difference, if I have one person who is both my buyer and my user, things are much simpler. I can test a market concept with them. They can say, yes, I think that solves a problem I have. I'm willing to buy that now if you put it in the market. When I have 2 people to deal with, one is the buyer, right, who is not going to ultimately use the end product. We now have the situation where the buyers and users may not agree on the problems and solutions, so things get more complicated. If we can go to the next slide, please. I don't need to read this slide to you, but what we're really getting at here is there's often a disconnect between buyers and users. Buyers may be trying to solve one set of problems, users may have another set of problems, and often users can feel disenfranchised in the process if they're not included. And buying decisions can sometimes be made without enough data. So there are a lot of things that can influence how buyers and users see problems or agree to disagree or not on what they are and what the right solution is. And if we go to the next slide. Why does this matter? Well, from a product perspective, it matters a lot, because if your product or solution doesn't meet the problem the buyer is trying to solve, they won't buy it, and therefore you have no adoption. If the product doesn't win the hearts and minds of the end users, they may use it, but not necessarily as willingly as you would hope. And then when it comes time to, for example, if you have an assessment in there, buying a software license, they may tell the buyers that they didn't like it, and you may have a retention problem, and people won't necessarily renew their licenses. And then finally, if neither the buyer or the user are particularly happy, you'll probably have a market penetration problem, because they will speak their minds to their friends and colleagues. And almost always friends and colleagues are the people that buyers and users trust the most. And so if we go to the next slide. So what did our NGSS assessment buyers and users agree on? Let's take a look. Next slide, please. Well, you can see that they put a lot of value on PAD. They cared a lot about performance tasks being centered in learning progressions that had the highest value. Determining if students are developing science process skills or inquiry skills in the context of science was considered most important. Assessment design should be based on research evidence, was also very important. Feedback on student achievement should be based on items of content that students actually took, was important. And finally, that the 3 domains should be integrated. And if we go to the next slide, I think you will find that if you go back and you think about the fact that we showed people examples of how PAD could play out in various solutions, now you can see the breakdown of how our buyers rated those. and 66.2% indicated that a progression-based performance task set was the best assessment type to assess NGSS. 29% thought that the testlet version that included more traditional multiple choices and TEIs tied to a learning progression was best, and customers did not place value on traditional standard-based assessments. So I think this is really sort of the money slide, if you will, but and very interesting data. If we go back, there you go. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here's our teachers, and you can see that they also felt that learning science was incredibly important. They wanted to know that the feedback that they got about student achievement was based on the items that actually students took. And again, the 3 domains were integrated. I think what is interesting here too is when teachers also said that they felt that they were only 50% confident in the test that they developed themselves. And they were only 20% confident in the evidence they got from large-scale assessment as being relevant to their classrooms. So just bear that in your mind as you're thinking about these data points. And if we go to the next slide, please. A couple of interesting themes that I thought I'd call out, which might bear more discussion. Let's go to the next slide. Were that as many teachers felt not to be using assessment results informatively for NGSS. And I think you can tie that back to the lack of confidence that teachers have in those results. But what was interesting is our buyers told us that they were using their assessment results to improve or develop curriculum. And I think that's very interesting and really begs some big questions about the linkages between curriculum and assessment for NGSS that could be explored further. You sort of wonder about if you're using assessment results that you're not willing to use for individual instruction to improve curriculum, if that's the best result that you could be hoping for. So that I think is an area of inquiry. And then if we go to the next slide, please. And the second thing was about learning science itself. So almost 90% of our participants said that it was really important that the tests be designed and items be designed on using research science on how students learn. So there was no doubt about that. However, here's an example of where you see that sort of breakdown, and there were more examples in the results that you can see in the paper, but you can see that learning science is important, but when asked, 46 buyers were aware of research evidence that constructed response items helped students transfer learning to their long-term memory, but 53 were not even aware such research existed, and there's a similar story on the teacher side. So I think there's a real opportunity for our learning scientists, colleagues in this audience, to think about how you get the market to understand in very concrete terms what the value PADD brings to the market in statements such as learning, constructive response items help students transfer learning to their long-term memories. I think a series of statements around the value and the evidence that can be brought forth using learning science is a really important endeavor that people might want to take on. And then finally, if we can move on, please, Paul. Again, clearly what we learned was that using PADD to develop new assessments for NGSS appears to be a problem that buyers are aware teachers have, which brings us back to teachers and buyers agreeing on the problem, and that buyers and users indicated a strong interest in assessments that use PADD as their design basis. And we went a step further and found out which solutions using PADD they most valued. And next slide, please. Of course, we did this research just before the pandemic impacted all our lives and our school systems. And so now we have the advent of remote and online learning for the foreseeable future. And also now we have enter the family and the caregiver as proxies for teachers as well. And so it really brings another dimension, no pun intended, to how assessment for NGSS might work in this new environment and what that means for PADD as well. And how do parents and caregivers understand the value of PAD and what assessments mean for their children. And then finally, Paul, last slide. So in conclusion, we can see there's significant interest. The next step PIF would tell us to take is to build a business case and do further research to refine what the costs of developing these assessments would be, what segments of the market are most interested, what price people are willing to pay, and does a company like WA have the distinctive competencies to successfully build this type of assessment? And I think for me, the real conclusion is not whether to pad, but who will pad first. And I'd like to thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Catherine. So a number of perspectives have been presented here, and our next presenter, Jeremy, is going to try to discuss them and also present a perspective of his own. Jeremy, let me get your slides up.
Sure, Paul, thanks. I'd like to thank all the authors and the presenters today for giving me something to reflect upon. And fair warning, I've never been a discussant before, so who knows if I'll get this right or not. Also, obviously, a caveat is that this is my perspective, and obviously I can't represent everybody in this, other state directors and their experience as we're going through this today. I'm not going to try to discuss each of the papers individually. I'm really focused on the themes that kind of rose to the top as I went through all of the material. So first I want to go back to Paul's original question is, why not more PAD? And I think, go ahead and advance, or Shazam, I should say. There we go. And Shazam one more time. I'm kind of worried I'm going to change forms if I keep saying it, but you never know. So the first thing that I'd say from as I looked at this with the educational measurement community business perspective is something to keep in mind is the RFP, or the request for proposal processes at the state level. They have significant impacts on how any business model is going to work. And then additionally, state education agencies or SEAs and their staffing and how those all work together. And I put these two pieces together because I think there's a lot of interplay here. So from my perspective anyway, state education agencies and their assessment staffs are not typically staffed, at least the majority of that staff are not education measurement experts, right? They're not from that background. They come from the classroom or high-level district staff. Additionally, that education SEA staff, there's seems to be a high level of turnover for any number of reasons, right? So maybe because of political impacts based on elections, right? A new superintendent comes in, there's turnover, those types of things. But there seems to be a high level of turnover. It might be it's a post-retirement gig, and for a few years somebody comes in, does the job, and then moves on and into full retirement. Or maybe the experience gives that person a chance to move on, either into a vendor, go work for a vendor, or other non-governmental agencies or organizations, or back to the district level. It's a jumping off place to go back to the district and have a promotion back there. So the reason I mention all of that is because those staff members are not typically industry experts, industry insiders. So when it comes to the RFP process, there's a couple of aspects of work. First of all, if they're satisfied, that RFP is going to just basically reflect what they're currently doing. It's not going to say this is something we need, and a lot of times they're not going to go out and say this is something we want to change, right? It might if it's not working correctly or if they don't understand a piece, but in general they're just going to write in that RFP what they're currently doing, and that's what is going to be provided. Um, it, that may change if there's a big vision in place to change something, but in basic terms, I would say that it's not. It's going to be what they do now, with maybe some updates of things or pain points or places there were pain points that they want updated and improved upon, right? So from my perspective, this is an opportunity for vendors to differentiate themselves and explain why this work is better, right? A way to potentially capture in my opinion, is a way to potentially capture a contract is by saying, this is something we do and this is how we do it and this is why it's better. You can always say, we'll do it the way that you've written it, but this is why we think this is this proposal to do it better. And I'm also going to connect this back to a theme that I noticed just watching today as well, is about language, right? So Paul, I'm trying not to be critical here, but your definition, right? If you go back to your definition, you have to study that definition, right? So I'm a high school English teacher. Okay, I'm very good at language and comprehension. I don't have a problem with that in general. Kristen, you mentioned the jargon, right? And how much jargon there is in this. So first of all, there's a language gap, right, between educators and assessment educators already, right? So people that tell me that I speak a different language than classroom educators. And then there's a language barrier between education measurement people and education assessment people. And so I would argue that there's a lot of language barrier in trying to help people understand the benefit of PAD. And because I think there's the survey is interesting, right? Because there was an attempt to distill that language down or to try to explain what those advantages are. I would argue, based on my perspective, that it needs to go further and there needs to be more work of explaining that in a way that meets the educators where they are, as opposed to trying to elevate the other way. So I think language is a big barrier with trying to help people understand the benefits. Go ahead and go to the next section here. So the second group, I'd talk about these two things together. I think this is an inflection point. I think NGSS and NGSS-like standards are in an inflection point because it's shifting the work that we do pretty significantly, right? Obviously, the standards, the content framework of these standards it seems to be different or is perceived to be different, and the work around doing it is been different, right? So I'll go back. Typical ways of developing content, writing items in Nebraska, we always bring in educators from the classroom every summer. Typically, it's worked really well. Math, science, or ELA, old science standards, we're able to train them in a shorter period of time. They're able to write content. After we review that content and revise that content with content experts, usually at the vendor level, we're able to use that content in our statewide assessments. NGSS standards or like standards, it's not working, right? There's too much complexity going on. There's too many differences. And so one, we really value that their educators are involved in that process. And if it's too complicated, or we can't get them to be in, then we're losing some value, right? So we've always considered that item writing is a great professional development or professional learning experience. And if we can't continue to have those teachers that be involved in it, then I think we're going to lose something in our processes. That's why we continue to pay to have, on site most of the time, item writing and our teachers coming together and doing that. So we don't want to lose out on that value. So if at this time PADD's going to create a process that we can continue to count on educators from the classroom to be involved in that work, to create high quality assessment content, whether it's tasks, items, prompts, whatever it is. I think we're at that point that we need to change so that we can continue to have those educators involved in that. And I think so I think we are at that inflection point. and I'm going to kind of continue to talk about NGSS a little bit here. Go ahead and go to the next click here, Paul.
Oops. Is that
No,
it?
go back. Yep.
Go back. Yes. Sorry.
Other way. There we go. One more.
One more.
There we go. Stay there. Okay. So educators always ask, when are we going to get more from summative assessments? Always. They always want more information. We always want to be able to get, educators always want more, right? Even when you sit them down and explain to them that summative assessment was not designed to do any more than give those summative results, they always want more. I think also the idea that statewide assessment teams, departments, offices are focusing more and more on a balanced assessment approach, right? So this pendulum is swinging back from the summative assessment piece more centrally again with this balanced assessment focus. So one thing to think about that balanced assessment approach, if we're creating reusable tools with PADD, right, and we're able to use those reusable tools for other levels of assessment, whether that's an interim, a benchmark, whether that's a classroom or formative. So those additional value that you're gonna potentially get from you having those reusable tools and being able to use those at different levels, I think creates a lot of value. So additionally, I'll go back to NGSS a little bit here. So our stakeholders decided that they really only wanted a single score from our science assessment because of those three integrated domains is doing science. You have to do all three of them to do science. So they said a single score is all we need because that promotes how we want them to teach it in the classroom, not as separate dimensions, but all together, right? So that makes some sense from that perspective, but they still want those results to be useful. And it seems that PADD is the only way to make those achievement level descriptors, the proficiency level descriptors, to have the value to be able to inform the classroom instruction and curriculum pieces. And so I think that it necessitates using this approach as well to make that happen, and is what I see. Also, I think, so go ahead and go to the next slide. So if COVID wouldn't have happened, we wouldn't have this example to give you, but I'm gonna go ahead and do this anyway. So COVID happens, we didn't test last year. We ask our vendors to think about how we could change what we were doing this year, what was already in the contract to benefit. So we didn't need new content developed this year because we already had the field test items that we needed. We were supposed to, just so you know, we were supposed to do a census field test last spring for our science tests for 5th grade and 8th grade. We were not able to do that, unfortunately. But we still had item writers coming in. We still had content creators coming in. So we worked together with NWA and we brought in ed counts. Ed counts has been vital to the skills grant. If you're not familiar with the skills grant work, you should check it out because a lot of what they created with that grant was very beneficial and it was based in PADD. And so we brought in ed counts, and basically what we did is we did really great work and created tasks for the classroom. But by doing that, we created those reusable tools that teachers can then go back to their classroom and going to be able to use. And we're going to be able to use those same reusable tools as we continue to develop more content for the summative test. We don't have NGSS, we have NGSS-like, and it's not very different, but it is, so I see a lot of value in what we did, and we wouldn't have done, well, I shouldn't say we wouldn't have done that. We might not have done that had COVID not have happened. And I think that's a powerful statement because we were tried to take advantage of COVID instead of letting it be something that was just going to hinder us. And so I think, and we still have to prove that it was useful, right? We still have to be able to pull that together. But we're so excited. We had staff developers, professional learning people from all over the state participate in that process, so they can take those tools and help the classroom teachers all over the state be able to use that. So if we wouldn't have had the virtual space, we wouldn't have been able to give that example of what we were able to do. There was one other thing that I wrote it down that I wanted to say that I thought of. Maybe I got it all. I think I go back to the language too, right? But overall, I think that's kind of what I have to say, I guess, and say I think we are at that inflection point, that we do need more value out of what we do. That policymakers are not satisfied with just a score. They want to know that it impacts learning, and that teachers get some benefit from it. And if we can get there through PADD, then we need to go that direction probably. And we need to ask more from those processes. And I see that being a trend that's not gonna stop. It's just gonna continue to go that direction. So I'm basically out of time. So I'll turn it back over to Paul to lead the question and answers. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was great. And thank you, all the presenters. Wonderful job. I've asked if you have any questions, please send them to me in the chat and I'll read them. Give you a moment to do that. I'm going to just put this back up here.
Hey, Paul, while you're waiting, can I ask one of my co-presenters a question, a provocative question, intentionally?
You asked no. That's the only kind of question you ask. So go ahead.
Steve, why do we have to have efficacy studies for PADD? I mean, where's an efficacy study for the same old, same old? Like, why are we holding ourselves to that bar? Like, when did we ever ask ourselves, is this the best way, the greatest way to do things?
Great question, Kristen. Let's not bother to check on the value of it. Let's just go forward with it and not worry about it. Now, in a more serious response, we should have been asking that, we should have been viewing that all along. And I think the fact that principled approaches arose says something about the efficacy of our now fading traditional practices, now expanding traditional practices. The first part of what I said was a joke.
Yeah.
There was a similar question in the chat. Shouldn't PADD show that students can learn better, faster, deeper, longer lasting, etc.? And that would be the efficacy. That would be the effectiveness of PADD, the impact of PADD. Can they provide better diagnostics for interventions, for example? Does anybody want to build on that, respond to that?
Well, I'm gonna throw that to Kristen because she made the argument for principled approaches in the service of assessment for learning. So maybe she should take the first crack at that response.
Paul, I can't find the question you're referring to. Who's it from?
Thomas G. 1115.
Yeah, I see that. I see that. So Thomas G, I don't know if PADD can show that students can learn better, but in my opinion, if you are truly committed to creating an assessment that is an assessment to inform instruction, or not to get into jargon, but I do like the term assessment for learning rather than an assessment of learning. I don't think you can take a conventional approach that, you know, again, to be provocative, in conventional approaches, gloss over, you know, at most a perfunctory nod to learning and cognition theory, gloss over item design, let the almighty prowess of psychometrics make up for all the gaps, because at the end of the day, all you're trying to do is make sure you get a highly reliable score that ranks order students, and you can prove, you know, like that ain't gonna cut it if what you're trying to do is tell teachers these students know and can do these things, and these students need help here to get to what we expect for proficiency. I just can't get my mind around how to do that in a serious way without the basic elements of PADD in place. And oh, by the way, let me just, something that's certainly tweet worthy from Steve's presentation, I put it in the chat. PADD is a mindset. This is a mindset of of every single individual on the interdisciplinary assessment design team. So Thomas, when I say that, you know, PADD has to be enacted, what if you were to interrogate me on that? At the bottom line is everyone has to have the same goal in mind and have the same values and beliefs about what makes a good assessment. And without that, it's going to fall apart.
Thank you, Kristen. I see Steve also put up a place if you want to see the validity argument tech reports, you can contact Steve. Other questions? I would build on what Kristen said as a mindset, and one of the I think foundational mindsets that you need is a return to first principles. That is that questioning the very assumptions. BCD, PADD helps you to question the very assumptions that your current approach to assessment is built on, and say what are the principles, the foundational principles that we're trying to achieve, and then how do we achieve them, rather than going forward based on routines and assumptions that perhaps we've all learned, you know, since graduate school. Other questions? Yes, there is the next session on alignment that's coming up. That's very much a principled assessment design influenced session. Who is supporting ED and revising peer review to be more PADD friendly? That's a good question. I'm going to ask the other participants here, the other panelists, who's supporting ED and revising peer review to be more PADD friendly?
ED meaning the feds?
Yes.
I mean, Scott I mean, I don't know if anybody's on here, Scott or somebody, but I felt like the last peer review guidance that came out in 2015, there was evolution there, right? I can't pull up an example at the top of my head right now, but I felt there was an evolution in that peer review guidance. If somebody knows of an example, but I think it's slow going, but I think peer review guidance is, I mean, gosh, I mean, think about it though. Here's a great example that just came to mind. The Race to the Top request for proposals from the feds required ECD. Hello, that was a huge thing. And you know, without it, there would have been no traction with either Park or SBAC to do the claims and the evidence and all the things. They neither were perfect, both were brilliant in their evolution, but none of that would have happened without that, without being able to point to that in the proposals.
Yeah, I'd add to what Kristen said and say the fact that you have to provide evidence in support of the critical elements is a parallel to validity argumentation, the way Tolman described it in the 50s. It's also consistent with how people are doing validity argument technical reports. You have to make claims, you have to provide evidence to support the claims, and you have to write the argument to show how the evidence supports the claim. That's a warrant, for example. I think the wisest way to do peer review submissions is to spell all that out for the peer reviewers so that they don't overlook any places where you have evidence to support what are the critical elements. So the whole structure of the whole peer review submission process is principled and in parallel with the common elements in those principled approaches that I talked about earlier.
The question for Jeremy, but also others. Do you think your colleagues around the country would be influenced by reading about PAD in a proposal?
I would say yes, but you have to make the value argument, right? Why is it? And it really has to be clear. As I read the papers, if I didn't have some experience, I don't know that I would have gotten there, right? With PAD, if we hadn't been doing the skills work with science that was based on principled assessment design, I'm not sure that I would have gotten there. So I think it has to be distilled down better than it is right now. I go back to that language barrier. I still think that we have to push our way past that and be very, very explicit in what it is. And I think, but yeah, any way that any innovation, any change that can give educators more information is going to be looked favorably upon, right? So it goes beyond the base needs of having that summative score. If it gives more information, then I think absolutely they're going to be open to it, right? And I think that what we're seeing is those ALDs, the PLDs, they're better and they give more information. If we can actually get teachers to go there to interpret results instead of what the actual achievement level is, whether developing, mastered, whatever it is, if we can get them to go to the ALDs and spend their time there, then we've done a great job of trying to get them to focus. And that's where Nebraska is spending a lot of time right now, is trying to figure out how to move those ALDs forward so that they're being used better, and also seeing if we can have multiple levels of assessment be defined by that. So can we use the same ALDs at the interim benchmark level? Can we use those same ALDs at the formative classroom level? Because if you can use the same ALDs across multiple assessments and levels of assessment, then the professional learning is going to be very valuable for those educators to spend the time to understand and be able to use that. And I think that's a big area where that value proposition is there, and could be bolstered to help the customer understand.
Thanks, Jeremy. And it's a great segue for me to say the session that starts in 30 minutes is really looking at alignment and looks a lot at PLDs and ALDs. So please join us for that. And we only have less than 60 seconds left. So I'd like to end this by, again, thanking all the presenters, Kristen, Steve, Catherine, Jeremy, great job. I love the way you bring in different perspectives and tie it all together with principled assessment design. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate it very much. And hope that you'll join us in 30 minutes for the next session. And remember to fill out your session evaluation.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.